Hello. Today, in our series on Africa's business leaders, we're in conversation with Swazi Tshabalala, a distinguished leader in African finance and development. Tshabalala has recently announced her candidacy for the presidency of the African Development Bank, bringing with her a wealth of experience and a proven track record of leadership. Her career spans nearly 3 decades, during which she's held pivotal roles in both the private and public sectors, including serving as the Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the African Development Bank. Her candidacy has garnered significant support, notably from the South African government, underscoring her commitment to advancing Africa's development agenda. Swazi Tshabalala, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the BRICS Africa Channel.
Thank you very much for having me, Peter. Thank you.
So it's a big job that you're a candidate for. For our viewers, perhaps give us some sense of your history, your career before the African Development Bank that you think perhaps has shaped you and got you ready for taking up a role such as president of the African Development Bank.
I have been involved in finance my entire life, in different roles, in the public and in the private sector. And of course, I think that this is what I bring to the table as a candidate. Having also worked my entire life on the continent and really having an interest in development, I was involved in developing projects in different parts of the continent. I have an understanding of, what Africa needs to do to really accelerate its development. So I bring that combination of public, private sector experience. I've also been on boards, so I also, from a governance point of view, I understand organizations operationally, but also from a governance point of view. And given the importance of partnering and working with the private sector to mobilize their resources for Africa's development, I think that, in addition, of course, to my experience at AfDB, I bring, a wide, experience, which, I think is appropriate, needed for development in Africa today.
You may have given me some clues in terms of my next question. Why do you want to be president of the African Development Bank?
So I'll speak, I think, from two perspectives. The first perspective is that as an African, and I don't hold any other passport. I'm, purely African. It's important to me that we finally get the development of Africa on the right trajectory. I also think that, we are at a kind of inflection point, geopolitically, if you look at what's happening in the world. And then if you look at, funding, bilateral funding, ODA for Africa, it is reducing, so there is a part of me that feels very, very strongly that we need to take matters into our own hands. And I think that we have the resources, to do that. So I'm motivated by that, in terms of the external, considerations. But I think also from a, professional and experience, I think that it's also time that we position the African Development Bank to be more focused and much more focused, especially on execution. The MDBs are very famous for approving financing that then takes the next 10 years to disperse. And of course, if you don't disperse on project, there can't be any development, there can't be any impact. So I'm really interested in those kinds of operational issues. And I think my background allows me to bring to bear that experience of how you run efficient, effective organizations.
Quite ambitious dreams that you have and great ones, but they will take resources. And AfDB clearly would need much more in terms of funding And I suspect that that's going to be one of the things that you're going to have to do. How are you going to mobilize the funding for the AfDB to be able to have the kind of impact that's required to change the continent to what it should be?
The African Development Bank, I think, is one of the largest institutions on the continent with capital of about $315 billion. So it's a huge, huge organization as things stand today. It's also the only AAA rated institution on the continent. And so it has a very good base and position, to actually bring others into this fight to especially build infrastructure in Africa. So having been at the bank, I think I can say quite comfortably that the bank has a lot of very talented individuals who are open to new ideas and are willing to innovate. And the bank was recognized by the G20 MDB reform working group as one of the most innovative MDBs in Africa. An example, for instance, was the introduction of what now is commonly known as hybrid capital. This was done by me at the African Development Bank, where effectively we thought about how do we mobilize funds from the private sector that are patient in nature and are exactly the kind of resources that we need to be able to develop the continent. I came up with that idea. I worked with the teams inside the bank, and we were finally able to issue the first hybrid instrument by an MDB. And interestingly enough, now all MDBs are looking at this sort of thing. So I think that the bank, there are opportunities to work with the private sector. I think the private sector has certain expectations about the way we should approach and work with them. One of the concerns, of course, is that MDBs take a long time to do anything. The private sector will not countenance the tying up of capital, for basically leaving it idle for long periods of time. So it's one of the areas that we need to look at. How do we meet the private sector halfway to allow them to actually deploy the trillions, even in Africa, if you're looking at African resources alone, trillions of dollars that are available for development. So it's going to take a combination of looking at our policies and procedures internally so that we can accommodate the expectations of the private sector. But it will also take, these sorts of, partnerships and innovation as well to come up with, out-of-the-box solutions for Africa.
Debt is a big issue for African nations. I think of Ghana, Zambia, for example. And I'm just wondering if the African Development Bank can find a way to assist countries deal with their debt burdens. And on the other hand, you've got loan repayment issues with some African countries. How do you balance loan sustainability and development at the same time?
So it's a very good question and a complex one, Peter. So first of all, there is a lot of countries that are either in debt distress or at risk of being in debt distress on the continent. And we talk about debt to GDP, reaching levels that are unsustainable for many countries. Some countries have, in fact, renegotiated their debt successfully. Some have, received support from the IMF. So there's a lot of initiatives, that are taking place to try and address that. So and the bank, to be fair, is involved, in supporting, those activities. But what should the bank really do? Because what is the problem, of debt? So, if you look at debt to GDP, there are two. There's a nominator and a denominator. And, you could focus all your energies on trying to reduce the debt, which effectively for many countries mean cutting spending on, important, economic initiatives and even, services to the people. Or you could also focus on how you accelerate and grow GDP. And in my mind, I think that MDBs can play a much bigger role in pushing that GDP, growth, because it's only when you have, sustainable growth in GDP that the issue of debt capacity and I'm not suggesting that there are not other issues as well. There are countries that I think are not transparent in the way they manage their debt. I think there are countries that, use their debt inappropriately for consumption rather than for long-term investment. So these are all the issues that would need to be addressed. But from my point of view, we will periodically always come to this issue of, oh, Africa is again in debt distress. And because this is not the first time, if we don't once and for all deal with the constraints to GDP growth in Africa, and for me, these are the lack of infrastructure in the continent.
You mentioned infrastructure, and that's something I want us to look at as well. We struggle quite a bit with infrastructure gaps, and also cross-border trade barriers are big issues. What strategies do you think the bank can employ to push and accelerate regional integration and fix this issue of infrastructure gaps?
The bank is, if you look at the high fives of the bank and you look at the 10-year strategy, infrastructure is an important, aspect of it. And you'll know that, for instance, Light Up and Power Africa is about energy access, energy infrastructure, and Integrate Africa is about railroad, air travel, that sort of thing, and also trade. So, those pillars are very much part of the bank strategy, which I helped obviously to develop, and I still think it's the right strategy for the bank. So, my approach is to say that we have, as an institution, been not as selective as we could be in terms of our approach to really helping Africa achieve the Africa we want. So for me, we can talk about many, many issues around, different areas to develop, but without electricity, there's no development. And without integrated road and rail, there is no, a trade, intra-Africa trade that will become meaningful. So I'm really focused. This is one of the most important pillars in my strategy to really accelerate investment in infrastructure, because for me, this is the precondition for Africa's development. And the African Development Bank actually is probably one of the biggest investors in infrastructure in Africa, has an excellent track record, for doing this, but we need to accelerate, we need to scale up, and we need to be more focused, I think, on that, because, as I say, it's a precondition for success for Africa.
I've heard you say quite a bit that we're at an inflection point on the continent, and there's a lot of potential. Uh, to be honest, for as long as I've been a journalist, this is what I've heard constantly over time, that we have potential and this is the moment. How do we move from that narrative of we can be and actually start being?
Yeah, it's a good question, and sometimes I think as MDBs we can overplay the role of MDBs because, frankly, development happens because governments make it happen. It's very, very important to say that what we bring can only be successfully translated into development in partnership with countries that are serious and focused on these issues. And so I think it's the reason why we keep having this narrative about developing Africa and seemingly still standing in place, is precisely because I think that we don't emphasize enough that successful development is actually dependent on governments successfully planning and marshalling efforts for development in their own country, and with us coming in with our resources to support countries to actually develop. So part of it is actually being able to sit and plan with countries, because you can imagine that for MDBs, we have targets, we have to deliver a certain amount of financing every year. And the risk is that, that is not necessarily, uh, deployment of those resources to the most transformational projects for countries, because it's too much effort to actually work with countries. So whoever is ready and whatever project is ready will go into it. I really want to see if we can change that. I really want to see if we can sit, for instance, with regional economic communities, sit with the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area, sit with Order NEPAD, and sit with countries in those regions, because I do think that, integration of trade in Africa will be done, region by region. And if we sit and we look at the priority projects and we plan the execution of those priority projects, and we agree that these are the priority projects, and also then implore countries to put in place the necessary regulatory framework that would allow us to deliver those projects seamlessly. I mean, if you are looking at a road that goes from one country to another, well, you have to have agreed certain things well ahead of implementation. So this is what I'm really hoping that we can take the approach of. It might mean that initially progress is slow, but as you engage and you agree these things, actually it facilitates much faster implementation of these regional infrastructure projects, which are a precondition for regional trade.
Okay, so sadly, some AfDB funded projects have been affected by things like corruption and mismanagement. How are you going to manage improving governance and accountability, especially given that some of these recipient countries are actually members and part owners of the bank?
Yeah, in fact, all 54 countries on the continent are members of the African Development Bank, and therefore are represented on the board of directors of the African Development Bank. I think that, there certainly have been problems with some of our projects, but perhaps not nearly as much as is believed, because, we have quite strict, policies in terms of, how we deploy money to. Actually, part of the problem, of course, is that our conditions are so stringent sometimes that, we approve projects that never actually, disperse, because there are issues, around, governance around the project. But really, the biggest issue I think faced by many member countries is capacity. A lot of them, for instance, may not have in the project implementation unit, whether implementing a road or you implementing a transmission line, may not have sufficient capacity in the project implementation units in those countries to actually be able to, do this project in the speed required, to the quality required, and to the governance standards required. So part of what my campaign is focused on as well, and because I'm a former insider, I understand where these weaknesses are. And in fact, the bank publishes, a review of projects on an ongoing basis through its independent evaluation unit. So these problems are well known. And my argument is that instead of pretending that they are not there, how about we focus on helping those countries build capacity of these project implementation units, help them with the frameworks, for instance, for procurement, and also then see how we can deploy technology in order to have a lot more transparency in the implementation of these projects.
It would be great if we could just focus on our continent and deal with our issues, but we are part of a global environment. And one of the things that we're seeing is rising global interest rates. How do you
Mm.
then manage loan sustainability, as we talked about earlier on, and yet you have these interest rate pressures coming to bear at the same time?
So what we do as an institution, what all MDBs do is that they leverage the capital that they have on their balance sheet to be able to raise, relatively cheap money from capital markets. And it's quite significant money that we can raise. And this is thanks to the AAA rating, of our institution. But in addition to that, the bank has, two big windows. It's got a third window as well, which is smaller. There's the bank window, and the bank window is mainly funded through leveraging the bank's capital to raise bonds in international capital markets. By the way, also raising bonds in African markets. It's very important. So, we raise bonds in South Africa, in Rand bonds. So we do raise local currency, financing as well. So that's the one, window. The other window is what we call the concessional window, which is the ADF, the African Development Fund. And that fund is funded with grants from donor countries, and it is designed to be concessional in nature and really intended to supplement, or not supplement, but at least provide resources to low income countries, many of whom don't have access to capital markets, and also would have no other funding if this funding was not available, and have no capacity at any rate for managing capital market debt. So on the side of the bank, obviously the AAA rating allows us to raise cheap funding, and in terms of the pricing, I think it's clear that it's very, very competitive pricing, better than any country on the continent can actually raise funding in capital markets. This is important. So our capacity, or the bank's capacity to be able to do that and maintain that capacity to do that, is very, very important. And then on the fund, I think that we need to start thinking differently about that, because it is so dependent on grants. And as countries, that are the primary donors to the fund, face their own issues, I think the bank needs to start thinking differently about how we fund low income countries.
All right, and perhaps to conclude our conversation, remind us again what sets you apart from the other candidates, and also what will your first 100 days look like as president?
So, I think what I've been saying, to everyone that I have been meeting is this whole issue of Africa being at an inflection point, and there's no time to waste. And I think I am unique among all the other candidates in the fact that I can make the claim that I will hit the ground running, and and it has credibility, because obviously I was in the leadership of the organization until recently. I was involved in the development of the 10-year strategy. So where the issues, the capacity of the organization, the challenges, what needs to change are very fresh, in my mind. So where for me this is important because there's no, and I always say this that every time we talk about Africa, the temptation is to say, oh, we need a new strategy, we need a new plan, we need a new development goals and all of these types. We have plenty of that. Africa does not need new plans. What it needs is a focus on execution of already existing plans towards the Africa we want. And I think that, I am focused on that. I have credibility in terms of running organizations and at the highest level, by the way. And I understand the continent. I've worked only in the continent. Some of my competitors have worked very little, on the continent. I understand the continent, and I bring this private public sector experience, which I've already demonstrated can be deployed for successfully for resource mobilization through the introduction of hybrid capital. So for me, I think that those are important attributes for where Africa is today, and this is what I bring to the debate, the discussion, and the choices that the shareholders have.
Swazi Tshabalala, it's been a pleasure talking to you. We wish you the best of luck. And yeah, thank you for sharing your time and your vision for the African Development Bank.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. It's nice to see you again.